Hi, everyone. Welcome to SEARAC June Community Call. Thank you for joining us. We are going to go ahead and get started. Apologies for the delay. We're just working out some technical difficulties, but we have a packed agenda today, so wanted to go ahead and get the call rolling. Thanks to everyone who is taking the time today, and we hope you, your loved ones, and your communities are doing well at this time. We also wanted to wish everyone a happy Pride Month and recognize the LGBTQ members of not only the Southeast Asian American community, but also of Black and Brown communities who are continuously on the front lines of the pursuit for equity and liberation. This month also happens to be Immigrant Heritage Month, and this past weekend we celebrated World Refugee Day. So we're very happy to have opportunities like our monthly community call, especially in June, to come together as a community at these times and close out this month with a special community call featuring organizers and youth leaders who are doing incredible work. So with that said, I'll start with an introduction of myself and the team members who are on the call with me today. So my name is Alyssa Talabot, and I am SEARAC's Senior Field Manager calling in today from Virginia. Next, I'll pass it to the other members of the SEARAC team on the call. So let's start with Selena and then go to Phoebe.
Hi, good day everyone. This is Sheila Pham. I'm the Partnership Manager at SEARAC, and I'm calling in today from Washington State.
Hi everyone, this is Phoebe Tran. I'm the Operations Manager at SEARAC, and I'm calling in from DC.
Awesome, thanks team. And with that, we will just head into some logistics and housekeeping rules. So just a reminder that all the attendees are placed on mute. To comment or ask questions throughout the webinar, you have to have access through GoToWebinar, so you have to log in as well as calling in. So feel free to shoot those to us throughout the webinar, and we'll try to rally them up and address them at the end, especially for the panel. We also have a resources section on your GoToWebinar control panel, where we have some handouts for you, including a copy of the presentation PDF, and a recording of today's call will be distributed following the call, so you don't have to take serious notes or anything like that. We'll be distributing the recording. We also want to acknowledge the limitations that we have for this call and for our previous community calls in terms of ASL and transcription. So this is something that was flagged to us, and we just want to address it and say that we'll be looking into any services that we can provide in the future, if not for community calls, but definitely for our larger trainings and convenings. So just wanted to acknowledge that. With that said, feel free to continue to send any logistics or technical assistance questions into the questions or chat function, and we'll do our best to get to those promptly. And now I will just review today's agenda. So like I mentioned, it's a pretty packed agenda. We have allotted for about an hour and a half just to make sure that our community call partners are given ample time to share about their work. So we'll start off with some national policy updates, and then we will have a bulk of the call being focused on the community partners panel. The Q&A session will then follow that, where you can submit your questions and ask the panelists something that you're thinking. And then we'll close out with some action steps and resources to make sure that you know how to get engaged. With that being said, I will kick off our community call like we usually do, which is with polls. So our first poll is, how many community calls of ours have you joined before? I will launch that now. And if folks could just take the next minute or so to get their answers in, we'll see what we get. Awesome, we'll give about 10 more seconds to get your answers in. right, I'll close it up and see what we got. Oh, great. So more than half of you have not attended any of our community calls before, so welcome. Hopefully this is not the last call you attend, and hopefully you're in the other categories next time. And about a fifth of you all have attended 4 or more, so thanks for the loyalty. Hopefully we continue to improve. If you have any suggestions for folks who are returning about how we can continue to make our calls better, feel free to send those our way. Awesome. So our next poll is to get a sense of where everyone is joining us from today. So I will launch this now. And if folks could just take the next minute or so to tell us where you're calling in from. Great, about 10 more seconds or so to get your final answers in. Cool, let's see what we've got. All right, so, okay, almost tied between West Coast and East Coast. So thanks East Coast for joining us later in the day, and West Coast, thanks for joining us on your lunch break. We do have some Midwest and Southern representation, so great to see that. No other, but if you fall into that category for some reason and you want to shoot us from where you're from so we can add it next time, feel free. So thanks everyone. Great to see folks from all across the country on today's call. The next poll I want to ask is to see in what capacity you're joining us today. So you can select one or more, so feel free to identify with as many of these categories as you'd like. So are you from a community-based organization, a foundation, maybe you're a researcher or a student? Are you from a national organization, or are you an individual who just wants to hear what we have to say on the call? So I'll give folks another 15, 20 seconds or so, and we'll see what we get. Another 5 or 10 seconds. All right, let's see our results. Oh, great. So almost half of everyone here is representing a community-based organization. So great to have some of y'all who are doing on the groundwork on the call. We also have 23% of folks who identify as a researcher or a student, so welcome to you all. And then over a fifth of you all are calling from national orgs, and then another 50% also identifies just interested individuals. So happy to have everyone on the call. Hopefully we're able to touch on topics that you all find valuable. But again, if you have any suggestions, feel free to send those our way. Our last and final poll of this introduction is just to get a sense of how the majority of your capacity has been dedicated these days. We definitely know that there's a lot going on in the country, and with the swell of nationwide uprisings in the midst of a pandemic, we just wanted to gauge how folks on the call have been responding and where your all's work is focused right now. So again, please feel free to select any and all that apply as your priorities, either organizationally or individually. So we'll give folks another 20 to 30 seconds or so. All right, about 5 more seconds. Great, let's see what we got. All right, so overwhelmingly, the majority of folks' capacity has been dedicated to solidarity with the Black community and support for the uprising. So great to hear, and you're definitely tuned into the right call for that because we have some incredible speakers who will be sharing about their work. We also want to acknowledge the 50% of folks who are still, dedicating a lot of capacity to COVID-19 relief, which is continuing to be an ongoing issue for many of our communities. We also have folks who are still dedicating some time to 2020 census as well as 2020 elections. So it's great to see that civic engagement component is also still being focused on for some of you all who have the capacity. For those of you who answered other, feel free to send those our way to see, to get a sense of what you all are working on. Would love to hear it. And with that, thanks everyone for getting into those polls for us. It really helps us to see who's on our call and how to make them more helpful for you all. So with that, I will take it back to the presentation. And we have a packed agenda again today, so I just want to make sure we have ample time to feature our panelists. I'll dive right into some federal policy updates. I'll wait for the presentation to just catch up to me real quick. Awesome. So the first thing I wanted to go over, in solidarity with the Black community and following the recent mass civil unrest following the death of George Floyd at the hands of the police, SEARAC has prioritized the monitoring of criminal justice legislation in Congress. The Just and Unifying Solutions to Invigorate Communities Everywhere, or Justice Act, is one policy introduced in the Senate following a Democratic-led proposal introduced earlier this month. Unfortunately, this bill has significant shortcomings, including but not limited to those listed here. In particular, the Justice Act authorizes an additional $7.6 billion to law enforcement agencies over the next 5 years, a move that is in opposition to civil rights organizations' demands to divest from the police. It also fails to eliminate qualified immunity, which allows law enforcement and other state and local officials to deprive people of their civil rights without consequence. It also fails to establish a national use of force standard. It does not prohibit racial profiling, chokeholds, or no-knock warrants, things that have been proven to be deadly for many in the Black community, and it also does not end the transfer of military equipment to state and local law enforcement agencies. So as you can see, there's a lot of significant shortcomings of the Justice Act. So in summary, it's an inadequate response and it fails to address demands for systemic change. So SEARAC, in solidarity with Black and civil rights organizations across the country, oppose the Justice Act and will not support legislation that fails to really create that systemic change to our criminal justice system. If the Justice Act passes, it will move to a floor vote, likely next week. So we encourage community members to call or email your senators to vote no on the motion to proceed to a vote on it. Next up, in the midst of fear and uncertainty in the country, the Trump administration continues to focus his attention on expanding his anti-immigrant policies. Just this week, the White House announced an executive order that expands and extends his immigration ban, which would further harm SEA families. So a little bit of context, back in April, President Trump introduced an executive order that banned entry to the United States based on family reunification and diversity visa programs. This most recent executive order extends this ban through the end of this year to December 31st, 2020. As the largest refugee community to ever resettle in the U.S., family-based immigration has long been a crucial avenue to reunite families which were splintered by war. And there are currently 1.4 million Asian community members waiting to reunite with their families in the U.S., and that includes over 210,000 individuals from Vietnam, 9,000 from Cambodia, and 2,000 from Laos. Some of these folks have been in the visa backlogs for over a decade, and they now face an even longer delay in reuniting with their families. What's even more concerning is that the executive order requires that the Department of Homeland Security take steps to prevent work authorization for individuals with a final order of removal. If DHS moves forward with these regulations, it would leave 15,000 Southeast Asian Americans unable to apply for work authorization and leaves those with orders for removal with little to no options for employment, which would funnel their families into poverty. This policy regarding work authorization does not go into effect until moving through a formal regulatory process. In the meantime, SEARAC recommends that individuals subject to any of the conditions above apply for or renew their work authorization as usual. In sum, SEARAC denounces the president's executive order and will continue to fight against these types of xenophobic policies from this administration. In addition, unfortunately, to this recent executive order, earlier this month, the Trump administration demonstrated hateful and inhumane immigration policies once again with its expansion of visa sanctions on Laos for not complying with the president's demands to speed up deportations from the U.S. The policy blocks the issuance of both permanent and temporary visas to Lao nationals who are seeking to enter the U.S. This includes tourist visas, certain work visas, and other visas that allow a path to a green card. As I mentioned earlier, this would impact roughly 2,000 community members in Laos who have been waiting to reunite with their families in the U.S. As the only Southeast Asian country with no repatriation agreement with the United States in place, Laos has been able to keep its deportation numbers relatively lower compared to Vietnam and Cambodia. As a result, thousands of Lao, Hmong, Unian, Khmer, and other ethnic minority community members with deportation orders have lived in the United States for decades. Many have rebuilt their lives post-incarceration. However, these visa sanctions have the potential to further shift the deportation landscape for Lao, Hmong, and other Lao minority community members with deportation orders. We have some statistics here. So since 1998, you can see that 4,500 community members have been issued deportation orders to Laos, with over 200 deportations and another 4,300 living in fear and limbo. If you or your family are potentially impacted by this policy change and you're willing to share your story, please email Sina, who's also on the call, at sina@searac.org. To round out our national policy updates, I wanted to end on a positive note and uplift the Supreme Court's decision last week to uphold the DACA program. So the DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, was created in 2012 under the Obama administration to provide temporary work authorization for individuals to enter the U.S. as children. The data we have show us that there are over 9,000 Vietnamese individuals who qualify for relief under DACA. Last week, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the Trump administration did not provide adequate justification for ending the program. And so while this does leave room for the administration to attempt to end the program again in the future, we celebrated this victory last week with our partner organizations for the more than 800,000 undocumented immigrants who have DACA status. We also recognize that our movement must continue to fight for all Americans, especially during this tumultuous time, by defunding the police force, funneling immigrants into deportation proceedings, providing a permanent pathway to citizenship for all immigrants, and ending deportations for Southeast Asians and other immigrant communities. SEARAC's policy team will continue to monitor new policies, including relief packages, and we'll be working to help share that information with you all to make sure that the Southeast Asian American community is kept informed of our federal policy analysis. But with that, I'm going to transition it over to Sina to moderate the part of today's call that I'm personally most excited about, our incredible panel of speakers from some of our partner organizations across the country.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for the policy updates. And our policy team will continue to, keep monitoring of these policies as they do develop. I am really, really excited to have this portion go into introducing our panelists today, who are amazing organizers and youth leaders in our Southeast Asian community. I do have just a quick adjustment we may need to make with, of course, technical difficulties as we're doing these community calls all through audio. I I may just need to adjust the order in which our panelists will be going in today. So Phoebe, who is doing our TA behind the scenes, please skip over any of the portion where we may need to readjust. Okay, so with that said, I'm happy to kick today's panel of community organizers off first with our first speaker. Today we were able to invite and receive their acceptance and excitement to share their work as well. So we appreciate them taking their time to share about conversations that have been happening in the Hmong, Lao, Khmer, Vietnamese, and Montagnard communities. We're really happy to be able to amplify their community voices. So we wanted to make sure some of their viewpoints and experiences were shared today, and thank you for joining. We will be taking questions at the end of each panelist, at the very end of the entire panel. So after each panelist, we'll work through each of their shares and responses and work, and then keep any type of questions towards the end. So if you have them for each panelist, please do share love for them, questions, comments in the chat box, and our staff will be monitoring it to pull up towards the end for the Q&A. So I want to thank all the speakers for taking the time to be on the call, and I'll go ahead and introduce the first panelist. Her name is Thao, and Z is a communications and fundraising specialist by day and grassroots organizer by night, most recently serving as a founding member and strategist for the Hmong for Black Lives Coalition. Her work is influenced by pioneers of reparative justice, intersectionality, and embodied trauma, healing for Black, Indigenous people of color. She is a 1.5 generation refugee from Thailand and is a descendant of the Indigenous Hmong people of Asia. She is one of the Mango and Peppers podcast team, a Hmong woman duo covering Asian diaspora pop culture and conversations on radical self-love. Z currently resides in North Minneapolis. Thanks for joining us today, Z. Are you on the line?
Hi, everyone. This is Z. I am on the line.
Hi, thank you for joining. Happy to hear your voice, and a lot of folks, I'm sure, who are on the line today have been hearing a lot about the on-the-ground happenings in Minnesota, in particular within the Hmong community. So your voice is so very important during this time. Could you share a little bit about the community's response and how members of the Hmong for Black Lives group you're a part of have been approaching this allyship for the Black community during this time?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I'm also really excited to hear from my fellow panelists also. And I just want to start off with saying what happened to George Floyd in Minneapolis was heartbreaking. It was an act of violence and racism and a reflection of the system that perpetuates acts of violence and racism in America. The murder of George Floyd has also consequently thrusted the Hmong American community into the headlines, with many people wanting answers why a person of color, specifically a Hmong police officer who was on the scene, did not do anything to stop the murder. The overwhelming response from many Hmong community members is that what happened to George Floyd was inhumane and unacceptable. Part of the reason for the emergence of the Hmong for Black Lives Coalition is to create a central Hmong politicized space that can address the deeply rooted history of anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and colonization that Hmong Americans benefit from, and also uphold and use to inflict harm, even in our own communities. Former Officer Thao belongs to our community. Even more personal for me, he is a member of the Thao clan. We need to claim him, we need to hold him accountable, and it needs to come from our own community as well. The Hmong for Black Lives consists of members that are Hmong students, artists, elected officials, nonprofit directors, community organizers, and emerging leaders all coming together in support of the movement for Black lives. We are a decentralized advocacy group, which means that we are not a organization or nonprofit on our own. Instead, we have members from various organizations and various community organized efforts who have joined this coalition to provide resources and discussion. We've come together in this collective space because it's our duty to stand in solidarity with our Black siblings. We recognize that the movement has been led by Black, queer, trans, and non-binary leaders, and in this space, we organize and seek justice for all Black lives. So this group page, which was created originally on Facebook, was created to communicate mobilized efforts primarily in the St. Paul and Minneapolis area. But outside of the mobilized efforts, we also seek to foster conversation, learning, and growth to better support the movement for Black lives and fight for justice, and have discovered that there are members who have joined the coalition group from all over the world to provide updates on what's happening in their neighborhoods and find affinity with others in the Hmong diaspora in this movement. So the last thing that I'll close out with is that anyone who is Hmong identifying is welcome to join the group. All we ask is that members in Hmong for Black Lives join with the intention to be active and engaged in conversations about the movement for Black lives, specifically how we as Hmong folks can be in solidarity with our Black siblings. We welcome this space as a place to grow and learn to better equip ourselves with the tools necessary to support the movement for Black lives. And when you join the group, what you will see is that we prioritize posts, materials, and resources that are rooted in community action, events, rallies, and volunteer opportunities, as well as discussion questions or reflections on how to support the movement for Black lives. And also providing education and resources to help build language and or understanding of the movement, both in Hmong and English, self-organizing initiatives outside of direct action work, as well as sharing original content from the brilliant minds of the Hmong artists and leaders who are part of this coalition, as well as sharing news and media and community updates. So last thing is regarding what's happening in Minneapolis, I just want to remind folks that this is a movement and a fight for real systemic change, and we are winning. So Minneapolis City Council members have taken public stances on abolishing the police. The University of Minnesota will no longer contract with Minneapolis Police Department for on-campus affairs. St. Paul and Minneapolis Public Schools has voted to cut ties with school resource officers, which has defunded millions of dollars from St. Paul Police Department and Minneapolis Department, which is millions of dollars that will be redistributed to fund the two largest school districts in the state of Minnesota. So yeah, that's a little bit about who we are and a little bit about me. Thank you for having me.
Wow, thank you so much, Dee. That's such an amazing share about your organization, about the work you're doing, and it's really so encouraging to hear that there are some wins in there. Thank you so much for sharing about the local work. Hopefully we'll be able to have a robust discussion later for you if anyone would like to continue expanding on those areas that you touched on that's being worked on in the community. We know it's so important and meaningful to have allies like yourself and youth leadership as well. So if folks on the call have questions for Dee, please feel free to send them in the chat for us. That's the function we'll be using to collect and monitor the questions, comments, and share love for her too. I definitely enjoyed hearing about her work. So we'll go ahead and also hear from more of our panelists. I will now transition to our Cambodian community panelist speaker, Sheila Xoài. So if we can have that slide pulled up for Sheila. So Sheila Xoài is part of the Southeast Asian Freedom Network, SEAC. SEAC was formed in 2011 to create a united front against Southeast Asian deportation, Today, SEAC is a member-based movement family of Southeast Asian-led organizations dedicated to the development and mobilization of Southeast Asian communities through base building, grassroots organizing, and movement building from a gender and queer justice lens. Sheila is based in Long Beach, California. This fall, she will begin doctoral studies in urban planning at UCLA to research community building in the Cambodian diaspora from an anti-imperialist, feminist, pro-Black perspective. Sheila is also an alumna of SEARAC's Leadership and Advocacy Training Program. So we're really excited to have her as a panelist doubly today. Sheila, welcome. Are you on the line?
Yeah, Valentina, I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. So today, I'm excited to hear from you. And we know that the Khmer community has hosted a community conversation earlier this month, and it's garnered so much viral impact, as well as sparking robust discussions. And we also know SEAC coordinated many of the community calls that a lot of the Southeast Asian solidarity has responded to. And we also know SEAC has been in this work for a few decades now. Can you share a bit about SEAC's work, how it overlaps with solidarity for the Black community, and important emergent themes from the Khmer community discussion?
Yeah, of course. Valentina, thank you so much for the introduction and the question. Like you said, SEAC is a movement family, and I want to start out by just shouting out all of our member organizations that make up SEAC, Khmer Girls in Action in my hometown of Long Beach, formerly incarcerated group Healing Together in your hometown, Valentina, in Seattle, Washington, Freedom Inc. in Madison, Wisconsin, Man Forward in the Twin Cities, Release Minnesota 8 in the Twin Cities, Viet Lead in Philly, Providence Youth Student Movement in Providence, Rhode Island, and Macon NYC in the Bronx, New York. I also want to take a second to shout out the Rising Majority. The Rising Majority is the non-Black people of color ally formation that flanks the movement for Black lives, of which we've been on leadership, or SEAC has been on leadership for the last 2 years. So back to your question, what we really found from these calls was that our folks already really deeply understand what's going on in this moment. Our elders, our parents, and older siblings know what it is to experience state violence directly because of the genocide, because of imperialism, and because of resettlement. They know what it is to witness the murder of their loved ones, to continually never feel safe, and to be on a journey to be seeking justice. As a second generation person, I can attest to the fact that the impact of this trauma lasts generations. So as a community, we have the experience and we have the deep capacity to understand this intimately, and therefore we have a responsibility to be in defense of Black lives. I'll remind folks too that being in defense of Black lives, being accomplices to Black liberation is not a new thing in the Southeast community. Sorry, can y'all hear me? Okay. So I was saying that being accomplices to Black liberation is not a new thing in the Southeast Asian community or in the Khmer community. Our youth have really been leading this work in service to the larger movement for abolition. So, for example, PRISM, Providence Youth Student Movement, was founded to dismantle the game database in Rhode Island that was criminalizing Black youth, Latinx youth, and Southeast Asian youth, and they won the most comprehensive police accountability legislation. Southeast Asians in the Bronx were documenting the impact of welfare deform in the 1990s on Southeast Asian families and profiling by the police. Y'all can't see me now because we're not on video, but I got my Freedom Inc. shirt on, and Freedom Inc. has been working to get police out of Madison schools, and that's going to a vote on Monday, and it's going to happen. So because our youth have really been leading the way, and because of our history, I promise y'all that in any conversations, that we have calling in our community right now to be on the right side of history, we're going to win. I'm not denying that we have folks in our families and our communities that have fully bought into white supremacy, but for them to deny why Black Lives Matter is to not deny our own history and to deny ourselves.
So I want to say a little bit more about this dynamic as it manifests into obstacles to being in full solidarity with Black folks. Firstly, we inherited and had to navigate in a white supremacist anti-Black system. And so in order for many of our folks to survive, a lot of folks have bought into that, right? And it's a lot to undo those material comforts that folks have achieved through buying into white supremacy, and also to undo that conditioning. But I think folks see now that we have to do that in order to be truly free and for our whole community to be free, right? And our whole selves to be free, not just the parts that appeal to whiteness. Secondly, we have to acknowledge that Cambodian folks are still healing. We know that our community has trauma, that our folks suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what I think we need to challenge folks to think about is, how do we heal from this in a way that doesn't create harm to others, right? Not just in our intention to not create harm to others, but also an impact. So for example, if our healing is having a commercial corridor, like we do in Long Beach with Cambodian businesses that we want to be proud of, can we critically check in with ourselves about how does standing in with business interests, how does that conflict with or stand in the way of fighting for Black lives in this moment and also beyond? And I'll come back to that. White supremacy really lives off of pitting our communities against one another. And so in this moment, in this uprising, what we see is that the issue of property damage and about immigrant businesses has really been a big hang-up in our ability to stand in full solidarity with Black lives. So I just want to name that issue that was really prevalent in our conversations with our families, that it was a dynamic of white supremacy. So these issues are really complex, and that's why it's so important in this moment to have conversation that is really generative. They're really difficult conversations. For some folks, they might take a long time, but this is really the work that we have to do. We can't ask Black folks to do it. White folks ain't gonna save us. This is our job, it's our responsibility, and so we have to be a movement, and that's why we call this a movement. For the Cambodian community, we must, and I think we can actually move fast. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sheila. You've shared so many poignant areas of work that intersect not only with what Dee shared in the Hmong community, but in terms of working together and how that has not been the case always. And so I really hear you, and the call there for, and SEARAC as well has really been inspired by these community calls and discussions happening around how to build solidarity, not just among Southeast Asians, but also with and for the Black community. So thank you so much for sharing so much of that work that you and Stephen and the organizations involved with Stephen is doing on the front lines. If folks on the call have questions for Sheila, please feel free to send them to us via the chat function again. We'll round up all of the audience questions, comments, and love you want to share in the Q&A session to follow after all of our panelists speak. With that, I will move to our next community speaker coming from the Laotian community discussion. We have Thongxy Phansopha. Thongxy may have some technical issues in connecting with us, so I just want to see if they are on the line right now. Thongxy, are you able to hear us?
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yay!
Oh, perfect. Wow.
Thank you so much for hanging in there. So I just wanted to make sure you were there before I did your wonderful introduction. So hold on tight. I will go ahead and introduce you. Thongxy Thongxy Phansopha is living the American dream after their family escaped a war-torn country exacerbated by U.S. imperialism. Their parents had no choice but to settle in Fresno, California. They identify as a queer, non-binary femme while pursuing higher education for upward mobility, learning some of the master's tools. They also realized they were assimilating to the point of erasure for their Lao identity. So they withdrew from school, started their activism by showing up against tuition hikes made annually by USC Regents. They also, from there, had been further radicalized by meeting other QT PCOs and organizing against white supremacy. They currently are part of the Liberation Collective for Black Sacramento Solidarity of Unhoused Peoples, Decarcerate Sacramento, and Volunteers for Anti-Police Terror Projects, Jail Support. They are currently working to radicalize Lao Americans as well as the Southeast Asian American community. They have many projects on the horizon, maybe another art collab, it sounds like, with a zine or music in their forte, and they aren't doing any of those things. If they aren't doing any of those things, they're digging in the trenches, gardening. Oh, cool. So Thongxy, are you still there?
Yeah, hi. That's really interesting to hear.
Welcome. So my question to you, thank you for being one of our speakers today. One of the challenges for the Southeast Asian community is some of our friends and family can be passive, and there's also passive racism to active anti-racism. So if you can help us in terms of maybe unpacking a bit internalized anti-Blackness, could you share how you and your community have addressed radicalizing folks in the Lao community?
Yeah, totally. There's a lot because that diaspora is real, you know, like, I think of it as like, just to be radical is just to have like a relationship with your family, you know, is you really have to use the really basic communication tools. And you have to like really meet people where they're at. You can't blame people for how they got to where they got to without trying to understand how they got there. You know what I mean? And so for me, and through the work that I've done, I understand how I've gotten here through assimilation, through imperialism, whatever, you know, has gotten me here today. And through my own journey, I understand how difficult it was for me to even get to where I'm at and understand how much I've been impacted and the traumas I've been impacted by, to have to like really slow down from a mental health and not really pursue things like society wants me to pursue it, you know, to be a productive member. So for me right now, like, I've been organizing on the streets here in Sacramento for a few years. I was a part of BLM Sacramento before it was disbanded and called for the leader to step down. But usually, so recently, as it pertains to this question, I was recently, you know, a victim of police violence. I mean, police violence is every day, you know, wherever they are, there's police violence. But I was dropping off food and snacks for the actions here in Sacramento, and it was the weekend, May 20th, where they were getting really wild with their tactics. You know, they were actually using rubber bullets and tear gas canisters here in Sacramento. And I was there for like 5-10 minutes, and I got shot in the face with a tear gas canister and like 8 rubber bullets all over my body. And I've been and yeah, and I know and it's really interesting. It's really ironic that I didn't want to be there, and I know if I was there, that would have happened anyways, because you know I just can't deal with cops. Like I can't deal with being around cops, so I just don't go. And so now, you know, I have a lawsuit pending against the city and SAC PD, and you know, making a GoFundMe and like calling for support about this issue was really difficult at first because I just knew how angry my community would be to see how terrible I was treated, by the excessive force and almost killed for nothing, for protesting or for supporting my comrades in the streets. And I was in the hospital for like 4 or 5 days. I've had one surgery for one of my skull fractures, and I have another surgery coming up for my jaw because it's been completely shattered by a rubber bullet. And so with this story going out, it allowed the conversation of Lao and Black solidarity and what that looks like. And I've been seeing that more and more with a lot of entrepreneurs and different Lao creatives really stepping up in the solidarity, in their allyship, I should say, too. And there's a bridge to the accomplices from there. But yeah, so I would the first person that called me after I posted that video was my cousin from San Diego, and she San Diego is very interesting because the culture of the police state there is so real because of the military. So people are all about law enforcement and what the fuck. But she called and she checked in on me, I was bawling, she was bawling, and she was really pissed. And that call ended up being really productive about the state of things with police and the relationship between, our Black brothers and sisters and communities and siblings and the Lao community, the Lao community is so divided, it seems, because of the classism, the colorism, the people who have been able to get out, had upward mobility from project housing. And where's it going with that? Anyways, but talking, so then then I was able to talk to my family about the situation, and it really opened dialogue for my family to talk about this in a way that I never thought it could happen. And I feel you can bring this story to your families, for all the Lao people, for all the Southeast Asian folks. It's interesting because the narrative of me going out there was that I deserved everything that happened to me, through whatever media or whoever wants to taint it. But what really happened was I was out there for 5-6 minutes supporting people, and I got shot up. This is not okay. Think of how much of a police state this is. It was a war zone out there. There was flashbangs, tear gas canisters, and they were just shooting at people. However they wanted to. But yes, so I mean, having this happen now, I'm a poster child for fucking police brutality here, and then there's a story coming out in ABCLA about we're banning the use of rubber bullets and tear gas canisters. Why do we even need that in the first place? These are military grade. We see this in other repressed countries abroad that we sell it to probably, and so yeah, so I'm sorry, I feel I'm just going off. I'm not sure if that got to that point. Hello, am I still connected?
Yeah, thank you so much, Thongxy. This is Dina. We definitely are still tuned in with you. Thank you for sharing.
Okay. I just sometimes when I talk too long, I'm just not sure.
Oh, that was great. That was really, personal. Thank you for sharing in terms of what you've experienced on the ground, on the front lines, and really the type of impact that organizers like yourself are facing. And thank you so much for.
Yeah, I would like to share. That I've got the worst of it, and I feel it is my duty to stand up for Black lives or for what had happened to me, to speak on behalf of I faced us Lao folks and people of color don't face the violence, the state violence that Black people face. I went out there and I subjected myself. I knew I was going to get in that situation for sure. but also it's that I survived, you know, like I survived all these shots and state violence. Like I am so grateful to be alive, because I thought I was gonna die. And you know, with the support of my community and everyone around me, like, you know, I'm recovering and healing well. But it really is like we have to put ourselves in the way of state violence and, you know, report back to your communities like, yes, this is happening. You know, like we can't just watch it happen and keep watching it happen. You can't like stand by the sidelines. Like this is like Vietnam War all over again. Like what are we gonna do? You know, are we just gonna sit in the middle of all this? Like they put us in the middle of this. And you know, and they sent us here as refugees, you know, to be grateful for what they gave us. But, you know, like now we understand our history. So like where do we stand with all this?
Right. Yeah, I appreciate and feel really a lot of gratitude you're with us today. I hope we'll be able to delve a little bit more in the Q&A after the rest of the panelists. We'll also share out from the Montagnard community as well as the Vietnamese community. So thank you so much for sharing your experience and what's happening on the ground, on the front lines, and in the Laotian community. I'll go ahead and shift to our next speaker. And if Sun, if you're on the line, I just want to make sure your audio is working as well. Can you say hello?
Hi, Tina and everybody.
Oh, yay. Okay, perfect. So I will go ahead and share the amazing work you're doing a little bit, just to give an intro before you go into expanding on what's going on in the Montagnard community. So I have with me now Son Bujri, who was born in Vietnam, lived in a refugee camp in Cambodia for 2 years, and resettled in Greensboro, North Carolina at the age of 6 with her family in 2002. Son's gender pronouns are she, her. Son is Montagnard, specifically from the Hmong tribe, an indigenous group found in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. North Carolina has the largest Montagnard community outside of Southeast Asia. She studied at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and graduated with a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology and International Studies. She volunteers extensively with the Montagnard Dega Association, promoting cultural preservation, research, and education. Son has been with the Southeast Asian Coalition Village, SEAC, for the past 2 years as the statewide base building organizer. And SEAC Village is a grassroots-led social justice organization serving Southeast Asians and Black communities in the South. She organizes civic engagement and policy campaigns with partners across North Carolina, building power in communities and uplifting the voices of marginalized people. Like Sheila, Son is also alumni of our leadership and advocacy training program, so we are also excited to have you here, representative as our alumni. Welcome, Son.
Thank you. Hey, y'all. I'm super excited to be here with you all in this virtual space. Thank you so much for having me. As Tina shared, my name is Soon. Gender pronouns are she, her, hers. I am an organizer at the SEAC Village. We're based in Charlotte, North Carolina. SEAC Village is a grassroots social justice organization. We are a village made up of Black and Southeast Asian communities. We've been fighting on the front lines for Black lives since 2013. This is our second uprising in Charlotte. As Tina also shared, I am Montagnard, specifically from the Hmong or Hmong tribe. Montagnard is a term created by the French colonizers, which means mountain people, completely ignoring our individual tribes. There are many indigenous tribes in the Central Highlands of Vietnam. The big tribes resettled in North Carolina are Rede or Ede, Jarai, Gahaw, Banad, and Bunong. North Carolina has the largest population outside of Southeast Asia and is estimated to be 14,000. Some historical context of our community is that we're actually more newly resettled in the U.S. We came in the late 80s and early 2000s. We were recruited by the U.S. Special Forces during the war because the Central Highland became a strategic area for supplies moving from the north to the south of Vietnam. Additionally, we knew the lay of the land, and because the U.S. knew that we had a tense relationship with the Vietnamese government, but we were abandoned with a false promise that the U.S. forces would return, and we're told to just keep on fighting. So our people stayed in the jungle and continued to fight 10 years after the war had officially ended. It's also important to note a couple of things that help us to understand this current moment and the Montier community. There is a history of missionaries in our homeland. Also, our communities were resettled by religious resettlement agency, so very Christian missionary heavy and very white saviors, and they continue to be a big influence in the community. We're also in the Bible Belt, so this is connected to how the community is situated with mainstream Southern culture here. It's also important to mention that our communities in Charlotte live in predominantly Black communities, go to predominantly Black schools, and have particular experiences. These are militarized neighborhoods with high police presence in the schools and on the streets. So these are the things at play at this moment. Since the uprising started almost a month ago here in North Carolina, I can share some of what I've seen as far as conversations and reactions. The first thing I saw was people really speaking about property damage. Folks didn't understand the context of the civil rights movement or how Asian folks have benefited from it. Although we shouldn't have to benefit from something in order to see the humanity in a group of people. NC is also home to, the Greensboro sit-ins and home to countless historically Black colleges and universities. So a lot of our Montier community members weren't making these connections. I also saw people wanting to protect the Montier identity and the privileges attached to it. There was a lot of backlash against my sign that said Montier for Black Lives. People were posting a lot of Candace Owen content to justify their position. People were saving my picture and putting out statements against what I was doing. People in the community actually called my parents to complain about what I was doing. People were turning to white saviors to explain what Black Lives Matter means, and when even listening to young Montier voices that were speaking up in solidarity. What I see a lot is of the don't rock the boat mentality, and we shouldn't say anything against the U.S., being fearful of seeming ungrateful for our position in the U.S. In my experience, there's this big idea in the Montier community that if you question the government and the way it is, then you're being un-American, despite how alienating American society is to Asians and seeing us as a constant foreigner. This is all connected to the influence of military folks from the war and the inherent anti-communist mentality of U.S. patriotism. There was a conversation that happened in the Montier community recently. It was led by a small resettlement organization that served the Montier community for a very long time. We talked about the Black Lives Matter movement, connected it to the police murder of a neurodivergent local Vietnamese auntie in Greensboro that SEAC fought for. We talked about the definitions and terminology like systemic racism, anti-Blackness, colorism, and such. There was a lot of people that joined the conversation that was just listening. A lot of this information was completely new for folks, but it was a good start, and I'm committed to helping us go deeper in our analysis and understanding to be able to make the connections in our experiences of oppression. We heard from younger folks that it's been super hard to have the conversation with family members because they didn't feel comfortable with the terminology in the Montier languages. So that's something we're definitely going to work on. But this work isn't something I'm doing alone. I found other Montier folks, mainly femmes, that want to move this forward, and I know that there are more of us. And the SEAC village, whether we're Montier, Southeast Asian, or whether Montier, Southeast Asian, or Black, has been a home for me and others, and is ready to continue the conversation and be a platform for this. We have a broad Montier base, and I definitely feel it in this virtual space that we're holding too. So that's all I wanted to share. I know that there are similar dynamics in other communities, so I can't wait to hear what others are doing and how doing to move this work forward. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, Soon. I appreciate so much of that sharing from the Montigar community, who we don't normally hear from with Southeast Asian Voices. So thank you so much for leading that work, as well as joining us today to share about that work. It's so important to have our movements in equity and inclusivity, and your point about developing language that our elders and community members can understand around this work and anti-Blackness and solidarity is really inspiring and amazing. So thank you. As usual, if folks on the call have questions for Soon, please feel free to send them via the chat function, and we'll round up all of them towards the end for Q&A to share out and have our presenters respond. With that, I will go ahead and move to our final panelist. Of course, not least, is Pham, who is a Vietnamese trans person who descends from a long legacy of warriors, healers, and shamans. Her life's work is in dreaming new futures where we are all limitless. And she makes those dreams a reality as a poet, an essayist, editor, and collaborative educator. You can learn more about her work from the 2 handouts we have included in this presentation. It is in the handout section. You can download all of our presenters' information. Catch her on Instagram at xoài.jpg. And her name is spelled Xoai. So that she's also on Twitter at Internet Fly. Again, her name is Xoai. Fly, are you on the line now?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yay, yes, we can. Great to hear you. Thank you so much for being here and sitting tight while we went through so many of the other community conversations and work that other leaders are doing in the community. And I know the Vietnamese community held also a really important call that garnered a lot of participants and a lot of discussion around what's happening right now in the current political landscape. Could you share about how the Vietnamese community members who participated in this conversation have responded nationwide, and just a bit about yourself and your work?
Yeah, so I wrote down a bunch of notes that I have that I'd love to share with folks. So I'm just gonna have it all out right now so that we have some time for questions, because I really want to dig into those questions from listeners. But first, before I continue, I want to acknowledge that I'm here in this moment as an individual carrying forward the work alongside so many people who paved the way, who've laid the bricks and put their bodies on the line for us. Among those are freedom fighters from the Southeast Asian Freedom Network, of which Sheila is on with us. And I want to specifically acknowledge some of the original folks who have been fighting deportation of Southeast Asian communities and building up the infrastructure of the Southeast Asian movement that we see today. Without them, we wouldn't have the movement that we have right here. Among these folks are Sarat Sung, Chaya Chom, and Kajua Va, and so many others who've committed decades of movement work. I want to acknowledge that even as I enter as an individual, I enter this space with my elders and my ancestors who are right here beside me. I enter this space as a descendant of countless trans and gender variant people throughout the world, throughout history, who've been buried by colonizers, who've had their knowledge erased. These people who are spiritual leaders, shamans, mediums, priests. All that history is not lost on me as I organize in this moment. Myself and other Viet folks are grappling with so many questions that other Southeast Asians are grappling with that folks have shared on this call. We're seeing a huge backlash within our families from those who've been swayed by conservative media, those of us who've committed ourselves to being what we call the model minority. I'm sure many of us have heard our families say, why can't Black families work harder. Folks have shared the commentary about looting. And so much of our organizing is cultural, more so than political. We're tasked with combating centuries of cultural training from the United States and from other colonizers like the Chinese and the French for centuries. We are tasked with combating the values that we've been trained to uphold and that have been passed down from generation to generation, like the idea that light skin is more valuable and beautiful, a toxic mindset that predates our arrival in the United States as refugees. This same mindset has made some Southeast Asians harm our own kin. I want to acknowledge that we don't have to pretend there is an animosity between countries and between ethnic groups. Vietnam has historically degraded and denigrated Cambodia as the folks who have often darker skin. Growing up, my family mocked me and called me Cambodian as one of the darker of the family. I also know that, among Southeast Asians, our Hmong and our Montagnard family are rarely in these conversations and have historically had a really complicated relationship with the United States and even with other Southeast Asians. So I know that our nationalism has harmed folks like the Hmong and Montagnard communities. So we engage with the work of defending Black lives with a complicated cultural situation. And this is a time where we have to come together as a united Southeast Asian front, while also being able to meet the tension that we've faced among one another. I also want to speak to the central demands of this movement as an individual and as an individual representing my communities, but not representing SEARAC. What this moment calls for is a spiritual reckoning. It calls for a spiritual reckoning in addition to the political solidarity that so many of us have been doing tirelessly. The central demand of this movement is to defund police. The abolition of police and prisons calls on us to not only remove resources from an institution that started off as slave patrols and Indian killers, meaning that the police started off as a group of people that were meant to police slaves and kill indigenous people on their own lands. Abolition seeks not only to divest from that and remove resources from the police and funnel them into the infrastructure we so desperately need, like comprehensive healthcare, housing, employment, education that we know so many of our young ones don't get. But that's not all. That's not all. Abolition requires us to not only invest in resources, but to also invest in ourselves, to trust one another, to trust that we have safety within ourselves and within each other, that we have the solutions we need to protect one another, and we always have had those solutions. Abolition requires that we dream bigger and we love harder. Abolition requires us to unlearn the values that pull us into harming one another, like anti-Blackness, misogyny, ableism, transphobia, among others. It asks us to do deep self-work. And it's not just about material conditions. It's about material conditions and our inner lives too. How can we take care of each other? How can we protect each other to the point where all of us believe the police to be obsolete? So when I think about abolition of police and prisons, I feel immense gratitude to the Black women and the Black trans people who have fought for this demand for so many years to no avail. And to this day, many Black women and many Black trans people don't get credit for all the years that they've put into abolitionist work. When I think about abolition, I see the police disappearing, just like the occupying armies in Southeast Asia disappearing. When I think about abolition, I think about all the Black and brown trans women, trans mothers who took in children that were cast out from their own families, who kept these children safe from police, fed them, housed them, loved them like their own, created families from scratch. When I think about abolition, I think about all of the children, the Black children here in the U.S., like Tamir Rice and Ayanna Stanley Jones, like the Southeast Asian children who were murdered during the war, who had more life to experience, who had more love to receive, who had families that still grieve them. I think about those children thriving and flourishing. So defunding and abolishing the police is not just a political demand. It's a spiritual demand. Defunding the police means defunding a morally bankrupt institution and investing in our own spirits, our bodies, and our futures. And that's why I believe we must be committed to abolition.
Thank you so much, Phi. I really appreciate and applaud your courage and so much of the call to honor those who have come before in this work as youth leadership during this time is really giving a lot of grounding back to places of Southeast Asian need for solidarity and a real honest look at where some of that history hasn't been the case beforehand, as well as giving some of those real tangible movement demands that your community and others in solidarity are working on. Here at SEARAC, we definitely are inspired by your work and others on this call, Sheila and Thongxy and Dee and Soon. And so I will, with the time we have remaining, want to thank you all again so much for, it's just unbelievable the amount of courage you all have and analysis and deep commitment to one another and solidarity for the Black community. So I will ask Alyssa if we can open it up to the comments and questions section now. And so we can maybe move to having some discussion or at least hear more from each of you with those questions. Alyssa, are you still on the line?
Yep. So I'll go ahead and just go through some of the questions that have come in. If you have any more questions or responses you'd like us to ask our panelists, please continue to send those via the chat function. But the first one I wanted to go to is directed to all the panelists. So it reads, there's this narrative that when we talk to SEA folks about what's happening during this time, we're only addressing anti-Blackness, which directs a sense of guilt and shame without addressing trauma. What should we all be aware of when we're having and holding these critical conversations with our loved ones and folks we're calling in about?
I think maybe we can have two panelists respond. Do I have any volunteers to take that up?
Oh, what was the question? Sorry.
Sure. It's about what should we all be aware of when we're having and holding these critical conversations with our loved ones and folks we're calling in about. And it references how right now when we're talking about what's happening now, we're only addressing anti-Blackness without addressing trauma necessarily.
Oh, yeah, that's so important because before we can even address anti-Blackness, we got to talk about mental health, and we have to talk about, I mean, when I say meet people where they're at, like what have they experienced to interact with the world in such a way where they're really close to us. So it's a lot of emotional labor that you should invest into the people that you love. And that will help create bonds, to build stronger communities. And I feel like through that, we can have those conversations, and it's not going to be easy. And it takes everyone to be vulnerable and to really sit at the table to talk. Yeah. And also, I guess with mental health trauma part is that, I mean, that's what we have to do. We have to, like, unpacking our trauma is really, I need a dead end because I don't know my parents' trauma. And when we talk about generational trauma and wars, like, how is it that, I'm still in a war zone here and my parents were in a war zone over there? It's like, we wonder about how that affects us. Maybe the state of the world now is like so normal to me that I'm so comfortable in like helicopters and sirens and bombs going off everywhere. And it's interesting now that it's 4th of July too, so it's like you know, imagine what our parents are experiencing when they hear the 4th of July, like going on, you know, when that was happening like 8 minutes every day for 9 years.
Thank you.
Thanks, Thongxy.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, this is Sheila. I just wanted to add really briefly that, you know, in thinking about how to talk to our folks, we have to recognize that there's multiple on-ramps, right? And I think I said this earlier, that what it means to be in movement is to move from where we are. And so we all got to move from that place, and we might not all be starting from the same place, but and it's true that we might not be able to take everyone with us either. That's not to say that we like reject or, you know, are really canceling folks, but in this moment when we're trying to move folks move as many folks as possible, that you know, some folks are going to take more energy than others, and we have to just be mindful of that. I'm not saying not to do it, but that we have to be mindful of that. But a lot of our folks are really more at a place where they're either complicit or they don't know how to move in this moment. So it does take, like Thongxy was saying, a lot of really deep listening, but there's no one else that's going to do that but us for our community. And so that's why it's our responsibility.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for also jumping in to respond with Thongxy around healing work that's needed in our community. To see Fly and Soon want to chime in at all before we move to the next question? Okay, hearing none right now for more responses to that question. Alyssa, did you want to give us, or it sounds like we may have time for one more question?
Yeah, so I think this might be a great question to end on and maybe give every speaker a chance to answer. So this question is, could each of the speakers share one tangible action for us to do to learn to make a difference?
Hi, this is Z. I can definitely share some tangible actions for folks who are in the Minneapolis area and outside. So earlier I mentioned all of the ways that, you know, this movement is winning right now. And one of the ones that I brought up was that the Minneapolis City Council is actually discussing abolishing the police tomorrow, which means that for folks who are listening in on the call who live in Minneapolis or know people who do live in Minneapolis, we are asking everyone to take an urgent action today to actually call the Minneapolis City Council members of their respective wards and demand that they don't want police in the city charter and support the city charter amendment. Because right now there is a charter amendment that is in discussion that is at risk of not passing because it will, what the risk is that it'll actually just swap out a Department of Police for a Division of Law Enforcement. And directly from the Black leaders from Black Visions Collective and Reclaim the Block, they have been very clear that such a semantic shift is unacceptable and is not true abolition. So we're asking folks who live in Minneapolis or who know folks who live in Minneapolis to mobilize and call their city council members, especially before the end of today, like just leaving a voicemail and asking that you don't want police in the city charter. So that's a local action that is a huge ask right now for Twin Cities folks. But on the other side of that is a lot of the world really, you know, I hate to say it, but it feels very much like the world is watching to see what Minneapolis and St. Paul and the Twin Cities is going to do next. And so I really urge everyone, if you haven't yet, to follow Black Visions Collective, Reclaim the Block, and MPD 150 on social media right now. Those are the folks who are really at the center of leading this movement and following their guidance and their leadership. And they have all of the resources and the language around what it actually means to abolish the police, what it means to fund and invest in community. So that would be like an action that folks can do right from their home.
Thank you, Z. Just to keep it flowing.
Hey, this is Xoài.
Oh, excellent. Go ahead, Xoài.
So I think a lot of folks have actually said a bunch of tangible actions that are really important right now. Among them, you can text 90975 with the words "Action Now" to receive text updates from the Movement for Black Lives. That's 90975. If you text that number, you'll get updates and action alerts from the Movement for Black Lives. But I think in terms of actions that an individual can do, I think a lot about reflection. I think that when we talk about what it means to be pro-Black or to defend Black lives, it by nature means that we're fighting against all systems of oppression. It means that, we're combating ableism, we're combating transphobia, we're combating the discrimination and violence that women face because Black people occupy all those spaces. There are Black disabled people, there are Black trans people, Black women. And so in indirect and also direct ways, we're all connected to the movement for Black lives. And we just have to reflect on our own experiences and the experiences of our families on how our history might connect with what's happening right now in the present, right? Like I think in the future, as we commit to having more accessible calls in terms of having an interpreter and having a transcriber for our disabled families, we have to recognize that when we make calls for disability justice, they are by nature pro-Black, in the same way that in this case, we're making sure that all of the people who are made disabled through intergenerational chemical warfare and so on, are going to be able to access this space that's meant for Southeast Asians. Those are one and the same demands, right? And so combating anti-Blackness is about creating a better world for all by nature. And so that is another reason why we have to be really focused on combating anti-Blackness in particular as well, and be specific about that.
Hi, this is Thongxy. Thank you for saying that. Yeah, that's a lot of. I'm trying to think of the different approaches. There's so many different ways to approach solidarity. Not only solidarity in the work of your own unpacking and unlearning, or you in the community. Self-care is very important. Self-care, taking care of yourself, taking care of the community. If you take care of yourself, then you can do that for you. What's important right now, and I want to reiterate, and we already do this in a lot of the communities, but mutual aid is so important. And so, like, find a mutual aid network, like, plug in and, like, work, trade, barter, like, support people, and people will support you, and create networks to support more vulnerable communities. In Sacramento, we have Sacramento Solidarity of Unhoused People, and we provide meal services, medical services, all those types of services right now because of COVID. And we keep every day, and we have like people who put that home, and then people who pass that day. And that's what's creating solidarity. It's a mutual aid. It's we're not like this is not charity. This is like work for a long term. We gotta create a foundation. I mean, I'll come back to it. It's fine with people. They don't have to be like practical to be fair. They just have to be
you can have that dialogue with your others. What does that look like? That's the most important. Definitely stay updated with what's going on. Look at what happened to Ferguson after that accident. And so, we really like to support the people on the ground now in Minnesota and all the other places that are having actions every day as well. So, and in terms of talking to your family, it's you talk to your family, it doesn't have to be about this right now, but it will have to later. And you don't have to use the language that we use to talk about this on this call. It's very it's very academic and it doesn't have access. So you have to take that courage, that access to understand this in a way that is not just your have real conversations. So it's gonna take your own work. You have to process yourself. So that's very important. And taking your own space is really important. And also creating support that is very possible. So you have all those things done and then the work is still it's support.
Thank you so much, Thongxy. Whether it was soon or Sheila or Fly, did y'all want to share any other action items before we close up?
Yeah, this is soon. I think base building is super important to us at SEAC. So I echo everything that all the panelists have shared. So definitely talking to our families, but I think also plugging into moving community members or organization or other segments that would move. If you are in the North Carolina, Charlotte area, if not, we have a bail support line that you can support through, like through Cash App and Venmo, which I can share with you with the whole SEARAC crew. And also, if y'all could follow SEAC Village on Instagram and Facebook, we're getting ready to launch for police out of our school district. And so we're having a lot of new campaigns that are going to be happening. So those are ways that folks can plug into.
Thank you, Sue. I'll go ahead with the few moments we have left. Wrap up the resources, which are so important as well to share with participants who are interested in staying in touch with all of our panelists. So Phoebe, if you could go to the last page. Again, as a reminder, the handouts has all of the contact information for our panelists, their organizations, articles, and what Fly has shared out in terms of texting and saying work and support of the movement for Black Lives. So all that information is in the handouts. For SEAC, and we also have created a solidarity resource hub where a lot of these Southeast Asian community conversations is housed along with resources and toolkits and other important tips, protesting, ways to take action, some historical context as well for the Southeast Asian community. So you can download it there, and we'll also try and share out the action items too that was shared from the panelists as a follow-up. I want to try and get any last-minute comments before the last few minutes. We'll have to fortunately close out. So if panelists want to share any last thoughts before we do, please feel free to in the next couple minutes.
Hey, this is Thongxy. I just want to give a shout out to the Southeast Asian support networks that are already out there. One's being created in Sacramento, and I'll post that wherever when we do have that together. And the Seed Project and is doing really great work having community calls. So like look to your local organizations, national, that are having community dialogue in on the ground also. So thank you. I wouldn't be here where I am without the other Lao communities keeping me updated about what's going on in that position. So shout out to the Seed Project and the Lao Writers Summit. And allow people and like that. And what the last thing is South Sea Press as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We're running a little over on closing up. So I just want to give my great gratitude and a deep thank you to everyone who joined us today, especially to our amazing panelists, youth leaders, powerful organizers. Thank you so much for sharing. And we hope to continue to amplify your work and build together moving forward. Stay safe, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.